Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Zambergen, and I'm the Community Manager at the Forum for Growth and Innovation at Harvard Business School. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Johnson to the BSSE Speaker Series, and I'm also thankful to all of you for joining us on Zoom this afternoon. It's great to have everyone here. In terms of the format for today's talk, which we'll record, Mark will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. During the question and answer period, you can hit the raise hand button and I'll do my best to call on you and we'll unmute your mic. And then you can ask Mark your question, of course. And before I hand the virtual microphone over to Mark, I'd like to briefly introduce him to those of you who may not already be familiar with his work. 20 years ago, Mark and Clayton Christensen co-founded Innosight, which is a strategic innovation consulting firm focused on helping organizations design and create the future rather than be disrupted by it. Currently, a senior partner at Innosight, Mark has over 2 decades of experience helping companies in a wide range of industries to create new growth strategies, navigate disruptive innovation, build innovation capabilities, and manage corporate transformation. Mark is also a well-established and highly regarded author, having written extensively on business model innovation and strategy. Most recently, in fact, just this past Tuesday, Mark, along with co-author Josh Suskowitz, published a book entitled Lead from the Future: How to Turn Visionary Thinking into Breakthrough Growth. Mark and Josh describe Lead from the Future as the capstone of Innosight's thinking about enterprise sustainability and growth as it has been developed over the last 20 years. And this hot off the press book, including the important concept of future back thinking, will be a primary focus of Mark's talk today. Mark, we're delighted to have you join us as a BSSE speaker. Welcome.
Thank you, Katie. It's great to be here.
All right, take it away. I'm going to mute myself, and then the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, as I said, thanks everybody for giving me the opportunity. I'm just trying to do 2 things at once here. Get my my screen up. So you can see the topic is visionary thinking in times of crisis. You know, based on as Katie mentioned, we just published the book. Just came out as of Tuesday at Harvard Business Review Press. And let me just take a moment just to where we are now, to Katie, to your point about 20 years. It really has been 20 years in the making. When I co-founded Innosight with Clay in January of 2000, so we're just a little past 20 years at this. You know, it's all focused on the work of the innovator's dilemma, of the idea that, you know, how do you think about addressing the threats of disruption, understanding, of course, the concept, but then how do you deal with it from a threat perspective? That quickly moved to how do you seize the principles to, how do you take those principles to seize opportunity? And, you know, how do you identify new market growth through the lens of disruptive innovation became really the work of Innosight. We realized, though, that the disruption, as I think all of you that know the work of disruptive innovation, was not in the technology, but in the business model. So Innosight evolved to really think through the full spectrum of the management of innovation, and in particular helping companies where they could deploy business model innovation to be able to drive breakthrough growth. But what we found time and time again was these barriers that kept cropping up in being successful in driving, you know, business model change types initiatives. One is that they never quite would, oftentimes they were shortchanged in the investment to begin with. Second, if there was anything that happened in the core, resources would get pulled back into the core. Third, there could oftentimes be an impatience for the incubation and acceleration time it takes to develop new and different growth initiatives. And so all that combined, we'd see that there was a breakdown in the resource allocation process. So that was tied towards leadership. And what we found was that there wasn't enough long-term strategic slash visionary thinking that came in behind the innovation effort. So it led us to think through more deeply strategy, vision, strategy making, and doing it in the right way to support the innovation teams and the innovation process for them to be successful. And then the final piece of the background here is it wasn't even enough to just think about the content of long-term strategy making tied to innovation, but also leadership and the right kind of leadership attributes as a team were important to come together to develop the right behaviors to enable leadership teams to work in parallel with innovation teams on a learning process so that they could begin to actually understand opportunity, to understand what it means to think about the art of the possible. So in a nutshell, this book formed really as the integration, as the capstone, as you said, of our thinking in terms of leadership, strategy, and innovation, and those disciplines of really how they have to come together for companies and other organizations to be able to own their future, to be able to be forward-looking, and to continue to sustain their business while being able to identify new and different disruptive opportunities. I'll just say up front, needless to say, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, and I think it's important to apply it to the situation. But I think more importantly is to say this way of thinking and this approach actually is more important than ever. That visionary thinking is what's going to propel the organization to think past all of these difficult times and this turbulence, to be able to have a way ahead, to think through in a purpose-driven way of what the organization should become, of what it could become, and what it should become past, say the 12 to 24 month period that we're going to be dealing with all this. So what I want to just sort of frame up, obviously, today is some of the thoughts around what is lead from the future mean? What is future back thinking tied to this ultimately innovation process? How do we think about it in the context of today? Namely, how do you still provide a long-term vision and an approach, but also tie it to the right kind of strategic thinking in the next 12 to 24 months to make a vision realized and address the turbulence that we're going to face for a while? And then how does that tie back to action today? And in particular, how do we drive the right learning process? Because learning is going to be a key piece. And I think others have talked about this. Nobody can know for sure what's in front of us. And so I think the organizations that have the most effective learning processes and learn the fastest are the ones that are going to be able to navigate. So that's a bit of a preamble. So let me dive into a way to, kind of frame this. And in classic Harvard Business School case method way, I'm going to start with what I think might appear as a overdone case to use, but actually the way I'm going to come at it, I don't think is very well known. There's lots of discussions around Apple and Steve Jobs and everything he did as an innovator and as a visionary, but I think it's oftentimes approached in terms of kind of his outsized personality, his reality distortion field, him as a human being and what he did. What I don't think is as well understood is that he actually was a long-term thinker as part of being a visionary, and he actually deployed a a way to take that vision and walk it back to what he needed to do at the time. This was in 2000 to be able to achieve a transformation for Apple. What's also interesting of what to use this example is that Apple's transformation happened in the middle of a crisis. It happened in the dot-com crisis of 2000, 2001. And what came out of this work was what first was the digital hub strategy. So Jobs and his team coming out of, a lot of difficulty in the late 90s, coming back into Apple, dealing with what a number of people, including in the industry, the CEO of Gateway, were saying was the inevitable commoditization of the personal computer, as well as the pressures that were happening with the dot-com bubble and burst. And he, in the midst of this, took his top 100 lieutenants and looked out 10 years to 2010 and said, what do we really have as a way to think about what we can become, and get past just thinking of ourselves as a computer company? And they came up with the idea of being a digital hub, that you could go beyond the computer, that the microprocessors in the computer could be the enabling hub for a whole bunch of different consumer electronic devices, powering them, taking all of the complexity out of the device and put it into the Apple product, into the Apple computer, and write elegant software that it would enable all of these devices to have the brains behind them to do what they needed to do as smart devices. That was what I would call the adjacency of Apple, is to move into this way of linking to consumer electronic products, but still leveraging off the computer. The white space move, or the breakthrough move for Apple, was actually say, we can actually make these devices ourselves. And this was not what was advertised to the world in 2000. This picture here was advertised, Steve Jobs announcing the Digital Hub strategy in January of 2001. Of course, he didn't announce anything like this to the world, but went carefully to prepare in a future back way to walk back that envisioned future of a digital hub and devices, and start developing carefully a roadmap and a pathway to realize its entry into different industry and spaces. So starting with, as we know, the iPod, and then the iTunes Store, which integrated together. That was a business model innovation in itself with the iPod, which is why it transformed the industry, even though it wasn't the first by any means to do MP3 players. It then moved to the iPhone and then the iPad. So there was a roadmap to move forward in time after having looked future back from the future and walked its way back. It's interesting that his vision, their vision of 2010, was not a vision statement, but it was actually a portfolio of ideas and products that could be imagined, and then walk back to initiatives in 2000 to move them forward in time. That's the basic concept of future back, and it's about us getting past vision as something more than just as what I think is a corporate exercise that tends to be a 1 or 2 sentence statement, be the number 1 and 2 of your industry, or develop really great products, but something that's more actionable. And how do you tie that to strategy? So with that as a backdrop, this case study, let me just give you in a nutshell, what is the essence of this idea of leading from the future? Well, first, it's a recognition to sustain growth and viability, including in times of crisis. We have to deal with the short term, and in this case of COVID-19, we have to deal with the immediacy of everything, but we also need to plan for the long term, both, I'd say the 5 to 10 year horizon to drive an inspiring, purpose-driven vision, but also to use this way of thinking to look out to the next 12 to 24 months, and be ready to understand that there may be a new normal out there, and you want to be able to look at it from the future back, so that you're not just extrapolating today on how things will be out 12 to 24 months, or even the future. There could be some real discontinuities. So we want to plan for the short term and the long term, operate and execute, and be able to explore and discover, and do this not just with innovation teams, but with leadership teams. And by the way, I would just say why I'm harping on this is typical strategic planning in organizations and corporations, in my view, is rarely long-term planning. It's more of a it's typically a 1 to 3 year, and it's more of a business planning budgeting exercise as truly imagining opportunities that go beyond the core and really setting a North Star direction for the organization. So we got to plan for the short term and the long term. In order to make the long term come alive, you've got to be able to develop an actionable vision that can be practical. It can be inspiring and hopeful and purpose driven, but it also needs to be at a level of detail to be actionable that can get translated into a strategy, meaning the the actual steps that you would take, the way that you would achieve winning the game to ultimately, get to what game you've decided to do as part of your vision. And then the final piece of this is, in order to do the development of vision and then translation to strategy in the right way, you've got to think in the right way, and you got to use the right process, which we call future back. And that's what I will further walk through kind of each of these major points to bring this home. So the first part of this is to be thinking about what does it mean about this whole idea of thinking in the long term. Well, one is to get past some of the is that long-term thinking is not practical, that nobody has a crystal ball, so therefore, spending a lot of time in it isn't valuable, or kind of worse, and that would certainly be unstated, is, well, I'm not going to be here 5 to 10 years from now. I'm not going to be in this job, so why bother to spend the time? And especially, I think that's really a leadership deficiency when that kind of talk or thinking happens, because good leaders should be mostly about being good stewards of the long-term viability of the organization. Especially board of directors should be ensuring and shepherding leadership to be that way. But the key, as you can see here, and there's nothing complicated to this, is if you don't spend some time out in the longer term horizon, it's very hard to be able to develop a point of view about the potential of different trends converging, some unforeseen faint or points of inflection that can come together, faint signals that you can develop now, that all those things could create a decline in your business that you might not see if you're only looking 3 years out, but that could become more real if you're looking more 5 to 10 years out, especially along the lines of commoditization, and things where, if you really push it further out, it's going to be a problem. We worked with a healthcare client who, in the medical supply side, in the contact lens business that they had, they talked about all these things that they would do to keep contact lens business viable, including designer lenses, more of kind of a beauty side, being able to combine with a pharmaceutical type agent for allergies and things like that. But when you got to the discussion, well, what if you look 10 years out? Nobody was in denial that it was going to be really hard to avoid some severe commoditization to the business. And if they just stayed in a pure contact lens business, it was going to be a very difficult business. So you end up in these kinds of discussions that you would not otherwise have. And you just have to have the right frame of mind, which is, you're not talking about precision in these discussions. You're talking more about a general point of view. You're trying to come up with not a full photograph, but an impressionist painting about that time horizon, and begin to get a few insights that are informative about, along with what you're thinking about in the short term, to be better about making resource allocation decisions. So one is about the decline. More importantly, though, we find organizations don't have a good measurement stick around opportunity cost of not investing in something. And again, looking in the long term brings those oftentimes unforeseen potential for opportunity development, based on the convergence of technology and other trends, to be able to see that, in fact, the opportunity is the more significant problem of not spending time in the future and being able to anticipate and plan for what those opportunities are around in the past the 3-year horizon. So that's the case for why we need to be doing the long term and not just the short term. I would say, again, with the COVID crisis, we're not only, we're not only talking 5 to 10 years now, but because trend lines have moved in terms of their trajectory way up, and other potential for points of inflection for discontinuity have moved way up as early as in the next couple of years. This looking beyond the horizon is as much about looking past 2 years as it is looking out to 3 to 5, but it's the same concept of trying to get where there's points of discontinuity and being able to have a discussion around them, understanding they're not going to be factually based exclusively. There'll be some facts. It's going to be more about assumptions and developing points of view that can be then tried to be tested by what kinds of investments you make today. So that's learning from, that's the importance of the future. In terms of vision, the reason we put so much emphasis on looking out in the long term and making that long term stick is recognizing that what's going to drive the commitment to the long term is vision. And just make it very clear, vision is thrown around a lot, just like strategy, but it's not typically well defined, and certainly not detailed out about what to make it practical. As I mentioned, a simple 1 to 2 sentence vision statement that's sort of tied maybe to a mission and values exercise is not what we're talking about. It's not going to be able to be converted practically into portfolio management. The vision we're talking about is creating those choices about the long-term future. If depending on your industry, can vary, but typically it's the 5+ years out. It's about making those choices and making them in the level that you're actually imagining what your core business would, could, and should look like, but also what beyond the core business and capabilities are we talking about? Similar to Apple having, its core computer business looking out to 2010, but a digital hub vision as well as a consumer electronics vision, and combining that together into a portfolio view. Versus strategy, which again is more about how to get there, and it's usually in a shorter term horizon. Vision is about the possibility of completely playing a different game, or a big part of what you do is a new game to play, versus strategy, which is really about how do you decide within that game where you're going to play and how you're going to win, as Roger Martin would say, in playing to win. And vision is really about the ends, where strategy is about the means. Vision's about as much purpose is to inspire the organization. It should be purpose driven. It should be giving it hope, which more important than ever in this crisis. It articulates a North Star, and it tangibly articulates that through a narrative that we find is the most powerful, that helps all stakeholders understand where the organization is trying to go. It's the art, if you will, of the equation, and strategy is more about the engineering. It's about the how do you operationalize that vision as well as improve the ability to win the game. So that's the second piece of this approach, which is, if you're going to think out long term for all the reasons I've cited, you've got to bring it alive by being able to develop and articulate a inspiring, powerful vision, and then translate that into strategy the means by which you're going to develop an actual detailed portfolio of the future and then walk it back to the present towards the investment decisions that you're going to make today. The last piece of the puzzle then says, in order to do this vision and strategy work from the long-term perspective, you've got to think in the right way. So future back is the right way to think about it, and it's both the thinking and the process. On the thinking side, we don't want to get into what we call the present forward fallacy, which is that that basically any business or industry is going to increment its way forward or develop its way forward indefinitely on kind of a similar paradigm. This is a picture of an early train in the 1820s, 1830s. Locomotive technology came in, and for the transportation industry, if you will, at the time, they took that technology and they brought it into the existing paradigm of transportation, which is the stagecoach. And they really didn't think about the propellants of possibility that the technology brought to bear. They thought under the lens of the way things are at the time. And as we know, innovation continued and really fundamentally changed what a train looks like, or a passenger train would look like. But vision has to not think in a present forward way. It has to be able to be a clean sheet way of thinking. It has to be open to determining what could be as opposed to what is. If Steve Jobs was just thinking in the paradigm of the computer, could have never envisioned going past to a whole different way to think about consumer electronics, which went outside of his industry. So future back thinking is important in order to make this vision come alive. And then the future back process, well, actually, let me just give you one other example. Here's a more recent one in the 60s when Goodyear got into the aerospace industry. The way it thought of itself developing a concept for a space station was, well, as you could see, it very much looked like a tire or an inner tube. Again, sort of stuck within the paradigms of the way things work today, the way things were in the past, but not really being able to imagine what could be totally outside of its existing paradigm. So this is the challenge that we all have. Alfred Chandler, a business historian at Harvard Business School, said, when we develop strategy, we want to make sure structure doesn't get in the way of strategy. This is analogies here of structure getting in the way of vision and strategy. And vision should be about what can transform the organization over a longer period of time. So that's the way of thinking. And just to bring it home, as I mentioned, the future back thinking is about what could be versus what is. It's being able to address discontinuities versus things being on a linear path. It's being willing to be more clean sheet oriented, more systems based thinking about developing a whole new system construct as opposed to, again, kind of off of point solutions of today. It's more questions than answers. It's very similar to the design thinking movement, except that it's brought, I think, right to bear towards top leadership and the strategy side of things, not just in the product development side. Other point I would mention is present forward thinking. There's absolutely nothing to criticize about present forward thinking. It's absolutely vital for our core business and core business operations, and even in the innovation efforts that happen within the core. And it's 80 to 90% of what a business should do is to operate and execute, including within traditional product development efforts, and use present forward thinking to build off the base and continue to increment and sustain the organization. But when it is time to think about addressing a growth gap or looking well into the future to develop new and different opportunities, new business model opportunities, you've got to be in future back mode. And this is the thinking piece of it. On the process, I use a little bit of a cartoon here to to point the idea. The process is pretty simple. You go out to 5 to 10 years. You imagine you have a debate and discussion about what the consumer and the customer are going to have as their important unmet jobs based on the circumstance of what early signals and trends and potential other disruptors could mean that give insights as to their implications for both threats and opportunities down the road. And then you develop your vision in terms of, again, like Apple, can you develop a narrative of the future about what would encompass the businesses that you would have and associated capabilities? That would be step one of a future back process, is to develop that vision and develop in the right way. Step two is to convert this vision and this narrative in the engineering sense to a strategy, which is basically how do you take that portfolio of the future and reverse engineer it. If this is what it needs to look like in 2030 as a business portfolio construct, what do things need to look like in 2027? If things look like this in 2027, what do we need to look like in 2024? So it is classic reverse engineering of the milestones that get you to your vision. And then you take that all the way back to today in terms of what we would call an innovation and growth portfolio, which has a similar set of categories of core, adjacent, and new that are a reflection of what you've defined for your future vision and future state portfolio. And then as step three, that you need to program how you're going to implement not only core growth, but breakthrough, new and different disruptive growth through the right governance and organizational structure, venture team approach. All of that stuff needs to come together to move the move the vision forward into actual implementation. And by doing that, you're focused on learning. It's about test and learn of these initiatives, of these investments toward proving or disproving aspects of your vision. So what this says is this process is not one and done. You continually invest in initiatives. You review what's working and what's not across the portfolio, and then you make adjustments in terms of those projects as you normally would. But you're also revisiting on a periodic basis, as often as every couple months, as a leadership team tied to what innovation teamwork is being done, to revisit the vision and shape what assumptions the leadership team has made about what goes behind that vision as you continue to move forward in time. This is a wholly different process than what happens today in strategy and strategic planning. It's more of a, if you do look out longer term and you're really trying to do something that's true strategy development, for the long term, it might only be done once every 5 years, or at best, it's something that's looked at maybe once a year. What I'm proposing here is you do the heavy lift to develop a powerful vision, and then the strategy to get there and the roadmap, the milestones along the way. But then leadership is revisiting all of that and carving out time to think in a future back way as often as every few months in a normal circumstance. In these circumstances, I would argue almost on a weekly basis, it should be dealing with the crisis, but then also reviewing the plans to get past the crisis with a vision and a strategy to get there, and continually toggling back and forth between 80 to 90% operations and execution, and the 10 to 20% about thinking about the future and how to drive initiatives towards that future, reviewing what's working, what's not, debating and discussing assumptions, and revectoring as needed, just very similar to what an innovation team would do. And then finally, just to reinforce the nature of the process of future back, whereas present forward and the operation and execution piece of what managers do is is a linear approach. You know, get the data, be informed by that data, and make decisions and take action. The future back process is a messy process. It's a iterative, generative learning process where you look out to the future and you develop a foresight. You explore trends and future assumptions. You then envision what could the organization look like, what it should look like in helping shape the future. And then you bring it back to a set of initiatives that are experiments to prove or disprove assumptions you've made, to discover what's viable and what's not about your North Star and then the path to get there. And that process of iterative learning requires um, able to revisit, as I mentioned, what you put together, because it is an unfolding development effort. It's not a one and done. To be able to think about the long term and to make it useful in terms of decision making today. The final piece of what I wanted to talk about is, you know, how would you systematize what I'm talking about into a way of being and a way of doing, in particular for leadership, because leadership is the one that has the resource allocation decisions, and they need to be involved with innovation teams more intensively than they have been, in my experience. They have to be almost on a somewhat parallel process to what breakthrough disruptive teams are doing. And the best way, I think, to create some discipline for leadership, to be able to be both present forward thinkers as well as future back thinkers and drive both a present forward planning process and a future back transformative process, is to think about a leadership framework, and recognize that, you know, for 80 to 90% of what they do, they should put their hats on in the present forward side and focus on the near term and the operations and execution. Recognize the process is going to be very ordered and analytical and linear, and it doesn't need to be in some kind of do loop with it. I mean, it's very efficient, can be very efficient. The decision making can be very, as it should be, fact-based and financially oriented. But then when it's time to carve out that 10 to 20% on whatever is the appropriate frequency, the left side is put aside and you put on a different thinking mindset. You're going to focus on the long term, and you're going to do it in this explore, envision, discovery kind of way. You're going to recognize that the process is messy and iterative and 3 steps forward and a step back, and there's going to be differences around assumptions that need to be managed through a dialogue format. It's going to be more creative in what you're trying to do. It's going to be as much art as engineering, as I said. And the decision making for leadership is not around necessarily or by any means exclusively financial, but it's going to be in large measure, what have we learned, what haven't we learned, specific to assumptions that have been made that underpin the vision and strategy, and the willingness to make adjustments and to reflect on what is working, what isn't, and be willing to incorporate it into what things need to, you know, what things need to be changed or adjusted to make progress in time. So that's basically you know, what I wanted to cover. Let me just close, and then we open it up to questions and answers by saying, if you wanted to think specific to the crisis and apply what I've just talked about, I would think about it in the following way. First and foremost, vision is more important than ever. People need hope. They need purpose. They need to have something to look forward to and to drive their motivation coming on the other side, and get past the noise to where the company wants to be, because at some point this crisis is going to go away and we'll get past all of this turbulence. So the vision piece, which drives the inspiration and hope and purpose, needs to be there, and that needs to be at a horizon where you can kind of see past the noise. The strategy piece, I would say, is the 12 to 24 month horizon with how are we going to get through this turbulence, and what's the right pathway to get to our ultimate vision. That's a hugely uncertain set of outcomes to be thinking about. And so scenario planning is going to be a big piece of what has to happen in the 12 to 24 months to debate and discuss different implications depending on the scenario and options based on how you would address if that scenario happened. And so that would be the second piece is thinking 12 to 24 months in a scenario planning kind of way. And then the third piece is, again, to remember that for now, in addition to the immediate tasks at hand to deal with the crisis, we need to be thinking about what are those small investments, as often as possible small, to spend a little to learn a lot. What are those investments, those initiatives that need to start being considered in development now to both address some of the new normal or things that could be different as early as the 12 to 24 months, depending on what the scenarios you've come up with, but are also still staying true to that vision that you've developed, that's the North Star for the organization. So that's how I would think about it, as again, a lot of these points of inflection have now moved much further up, closer into our time horizon. And this is what's going to be the key to allow us to be successful, addressing the immediate problems at hand, but also being effective as planners. That's going to help us prepare to be in a good place when all of this is passed. So I now open it up to questions, and Katie, I turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. All right. Can you unshare your screen, Mark?
Yes. Let me do that.
And I know we've already got some questions. Let's start with Sufana. Are you able to unmute yourself, Sufana? Oh yeah, you are. Okay.
Right, so can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for this informative, motivating kind of talk. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about Clay's theories, for instance. So he has always taught us and talked about how those theories help you project and foresee the future. So not depending entirely on past data and trying to make decisions based on past facts. So how can you comment on the last slide you have had, which is having a vision from now to the future versus the other type, future back? Where do you think the theories of Clay would fall between those two frameworks?
Yep. Well, that's a great question, Sufana. You know, one way to frame that in terms of Clay's work, his latest framing of innovation, right, has been there are efficiency innovations, there's sustaining innovations, and there's market creating innovations. When you're dealing with the efficiency innovations or sustaining innovations, that theory would be applied from a leadership process point of view on the left-hand side, the present forward approach. Anything that would be around the market creating innovation, which is the new form of what you'd say disruptive innovation, right? To address non-consumption and, you know, ability to enable a larger population of less skilled or less wealthy people to do things for themselves. The ability to set up for imagining and developing a construct for that non-consumption idea is best done in a future back mode, both for the innovation team, but also in the leadership team trying to review the prioritization of market creating innovation. So I've often thought about sustaining on the left side, disruptive on the right, sustaining efficiency innovations in particular on the left, market creating innovations, business model innovation, things that are discontinuous, like cost transformation, where it's not just going to be, moving forward in a linear path, but literally a transformative function. Because of the transformative nature, it's best to do anything that's nonlinear should be done from a future back way of thinking and a process approach. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Next is a question from Global Ali. If you can unmute yourself.
Hey, Mark, it's Ali here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Ali. How are you?
Good, thank you. Great talk. Joined a little late, so forgive me if my question has been answered already in your talk. To illustrate some concrete examples of the future back, if we go back to your cartoon illustration, which was really nice, to the moon and back, could you mention 1, 2, or 3 companies that have done the kind of future back, and maybe give an example of a product or a vision? Like, for instance, Johnson & Johnson had the disease interception and evolved into, I guess, a world without disease. So they tested and they thought from disease interception to world without disease. So that would, I think, really help.
Yeah, no, good point. So in terms of one example, like I said, I really do think even if it was more intuition than making it explicit, I don't think there's any doubt that first, as Apple, and in particular why I said it was relevant was because it shows that you can do this, and in fact, maybe more importantly, in times of crisis. Johnson & Johnson in their Janssen Pharmaceuticals division, they're sort of the opposite. They did this in a time of, as they said, they were fixing the roof while the sun was still shining. I mean, their organization, their business was doing really well. And they looked out to the future to 2030, and this was in the 2014 timeframe. And they saw the convergence of a number of different healthcare trends around personal devices and biometrics and where life sciences were going. And they set a vision, the Janssen vision, as you said, a world without disease. It was about how do you prevent, intercept, and cure diseases, as opposed to just the break, fix, repair cycle. And it was very disruptive for a pharmaceutical company whose whole business model is centered around treatment. So they looked out to the future, and based on where they saw the convergence of trends, they looked out 15 plus years and came up with their vision. And I was actually just going to read just a couple of the words on it. They said, as far as to just bring home the point about it's not just a couple sentence statement. It was Janssen's vision of a world without disease. We envision a world in which widespread disease is a historical artifact. They will live healthier by technological and medical advances that prevent, intercept, and cure diseases. I'm paraphrasing this, by the way, just because it would take too long otherwise. We will develop comprehensive strategies in disease areas by identifying people at risk of developing a disease, monitoring disease-causing processes, and intervening with clinically proven therapies to intercept the development of the disease, and that we would work to develop world-class healthcare products, but also tap into a broader biomedical research ecosystem to develop the technology solutions and regulatory protocols and business models that would allow us to realize our vision. Again, I shortened that a bit, but I think that's a classic example where there was a vision on disease interception. They walked that back to what they're working on today as basically their first effort, which is a lung cancer initiative. They've also talked about doing it for diabetes and also for colorectal cancer. So they're working through what they said were the high priority areas where they had the highest opportunity to be able to make progress. But it started by looking out to 2030 and seeing the convergence, of what was happening with life sciences, as I mentioned. I'm just looking, there was, so the four things that they said were going to converge was life sciences, disease diagnosis, in terms of having the ability to personalize medicine and have continuous surveillance of at-risk patients, and then shift therapies from a one-size-fits-all treatment to more personalized integrated interventions, and then shifting that we know about in the healthcare service delivery model. But I think that one is a key one in being able to think future back. The other one was the work we did with Aetna in the early 2010 with Mark Bernalini, who in the middle of having a 38% increase in profits in large measure with the Affordable Care Act, looked to the future and said he didn't see the future of health insurance being sustainable. And long story short, shifted in the way of thinking from more of a B2B, sort of a payments, being able to support health insurance within large corporations to be more consumer centric, and how do you manage the health and well-being of individuals, even in the midst of having such massive growth, was able to look past and do it in a future back way to say, we're going to look out 10 years, and how do we decide, in addition to taking advantage of all this core growth, how do we begin planting the seeds, which ultimately led to the acquisition by CVS of Aetna. So those are, I know those are both healthcare examples, but hopefully that gives some specifics case-wise to how this process is working literally with companies, in the more recent times.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
The next question comes from Tommaso Padula.
Hi. Thank you for the right pronunciation. Was perfect. My question is related to resource allocation. When you speak about to weight both the present and the future, you say about time, 80% about the present and 20% about the future. And when we speak about other resources, for example, percentage of revenue invested in the future, or percentage of research and development, or the percentage of employees that are in activity, task into the future, which should be, according to your experience, the right weight?
Yeah. Well, let me start with some top level categories, because it's a great question. The kind of the categories of resource allocation. At the top level, I would put it in three buckets, which would be dollars and people as a second, and then just as important as management, leadership bandwidth. So as we think about carving out the resources and separating them out, very classic disruptive, separate unit, it's very similar along those lines, but it's important to think about it. It is in all of those three dimensions. You allocate dollars, you allocate people, and you allocate senior leadership bandwidth. And that bandwidth piece is often the part that's overlooked. In doing that, in what gets developed at the top, and then what cascades into what are the initiatives that need to be carved out along core and adjacent and new and different, white space areas or breakthrough growth areas. I think then what should underpin that is a cascade down, or a kind of goals flow down, if you want to call it that, where our experience is R&D organizations, for example, what they're doing with R&D is heavily skewed towards supporting the core. That their resources, yeah, they're trying to do breakthrough, but it's really radical breakthrough to core and ensure and try to keep the viability of the core, as opposed to carving out resources for breakthrough efforts. And we've seen all the time working with R&D organizations, their own frustration that all of their work is skewing towards really supporting core business units and what they're continuing to do, as opposed to really carving out towards a future that goes beyond, in support of new business opportunities. So absolutely, I think R&D has to think about what they're doing as a reflection of what is the enterprise growth and innovation remit or portfolio. And that would, I think, for sure. Other functions, I mean, you'd have to really think it through to kind of say, but I do think it cascades from an enterprise view to a business unit and functional view, where I think a similar way of thinking has to be applied, so that you're not just thinking about what is everything behind to support the present operations. And we call this, by the way, the present forward fallacy, which is the notion that you can continue to extend out an existing set of businesses indefinitely. So this resource allocation way of thinking has to cascade to business units and to functions. Does that answer your question?
Yes, you structured me clearly, in particular, which should be the most three important bucket. What I was also curious about, if you have some kind of data about percentage. Usually at least 10% should be dedicated to the future of the employees and the revenue, or something like that. If you have, it doesn't matter if you don't have.
Well, what we have found, we use like the 5 to 10 year horizon as more of a sort of an iconic, or what's the word, like a representation of long-term thinking. For some, you might think as a software company, it might be a little less than 5 years. And if you're a pharmaceutical company, it might be 15 years. The same thing with this 10 to 20% is it's going to really vary. And there's not really, it's very hard in any of this to put in, sort of case data that would say, this is exactly how much you should be allocating. We use it as almost like thumb rules, and just also empirically our experience. If you're less than 10%, you're not really driving a difference in trying to move forward to really create something that is going to get beyond the core. If you're more than 20%, first of all, you've got a real problem with the core if you're really going to be trying to allocate that much. And the second is, and Clay's talked a lot about this, if spending a little to learn a lot, being patient for revenues, impatient for profit, you're going to be violating those principles. The whole point of this is to be allocating resources in a way that is not about making a difference in the short term. Disruption's never about it's going to do anything for quarterly earnings. It's about being able to stay in learning mode and do it in the right way. So our experience has been, if you're in that 10 to 20%, then you're giving it enough of what it needs to be, but you're not giving so much that you're violating. Either you're in a problem worse than being able to do this in the right way, and you're also not becoming impatient for what is needed to incubate and scale these in the right way. And then in between that 10 and 20, I think a lot of this is about trying to give ingredients and not the recipe. I think it's management judgment to come up with the right approach overall and the right percentage.
Thank you. You perfectly answer me, and you give me a threshold. The more you give me that what is really matter, which are the objects that you have and on how much you allocate.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tommaso, for the question. Next is Alok Patel.
Thanks, Katie. G'day, Mark. I'm curious. So a lot of organisations aren't in the habit of looking 5 years or beyond. How do you start the process to get them to shift gears, knowing that a lot of this is not a practical exercise, as you sort of said, art versus engineering. Is this, and I suppose it'd be useful to, if you could kind of depict the differences between engaging the board with conversation versus executives and managers. If you could do that, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, one, and I didn't share it in my talk, but one of the pieces of data that I do share in the book is work that we did in terms of laying out annualized total shareholder return versus margin expansion as one chart, and then average total shareholder return versus revenue growth. And we did this over an 8 to 10 year period. And when you looked over an 8 to 10 year or 8 year period, actually, and we took the top 20 market cap S&P 500 companies, and what you found was when you did it by margin expansion, change in operating margin, there was no correlation of increase in margin basis points to total shareholder return of these companies. When you did it by revenue growth, which was driven long-term revenue growth, which meant that there was a investment in growth platforms and that continued to drive the top line and not trying to weed out, further extract more in terms of profitability, there was a perfect correlation. There was a perfect lineup. So, one is, I think, making the case, to management and to the board, to be able to show that there is actually financial evidence. There's real evidence about a long-term thinking does ultimately drive total shareholder return. And again, you'd be thinking about that over the long term. Businesses are comprised of a leadership team, and oftentimes that leadership team changes out, right? So how do you drive the continuity? Well, I think the continuity has to happen at the board level. They need to be the ones that are ensuring that there is this looking out to the future and worrying about the long-term viability, along with ensuring that the short-term operations deliver, the earnings and everything that they need to do. So that's the other way I would think about it. The final piece, if I understand all of that you were asking in the question, is, how do you get organizations to embrace this with all of the things coming at them? I think it starts with language. It's what Clay used to say, start with a common language, a common way to frame things, give them a way of thinking, build the case in terms of like this example of long-term revenue growth versus total shareholder return. Talk about, the concept of opportunity cost, which in our research shows heavily that opportunity gets lost or missed when you only look out 2 to 3 years. You're not going to do market creating innovation unless you have a point of view about its potential and recognize, that a lot of those market creating innovations will fully come to fruition based on the convergence of a set of things that are 5+ years out. So I think you have to make the case for market creating, that language piece. And then the other part of that, I convince them, is if you're investing in a chief innovation officer and an innovation teams, which by definition, you're doing that not because you're saying we need to do better product development, but you're really trying to invest in organic growth through innovation, is making the case that these innovation teams never succeed without leadership teams going along for the journey. So, I think those would be the set of things I would say to try to help reorient organizations, leadership, and their boards towards putting more commitment. And then, of course, like Ali said, what are examples? I think providing examples of where this has worked, where this is working, I think is what can hopefully convince an organization and their leadership to embrace this before they face, a shortfall in their growth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question. Next, we've got a question from Santiago Martin Ramani.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for that insightful chat. Really appreciate that. My question, I was thinking about, if I may, how about if instead of moving for a little moment away from focusing so much on corporations and firms and the benefit for the short, medium, long term, how about if we focus a little bit more on what we as individuals or as a community could do, for example, for the planet to be more sustainable. So specifically, there's a lot of brain power in this virtual room and beyond. My question would be, how can we apply this future back way of a virtual community to brainstorm on disruptive new business models that make the planet more sustainable? For example, what comes after Uber, Airbnb, sharing models? How can we leverage crowdsourcing? There are a few examples that are happening right now with much lower car traffic or trucks and much lower airplanes over the earth. There's much less pollution. And while animals are roaming around, the planet is getting a break. Now we're given an opportunity for the planet to refresh. Mm-hmm. What else can we do? How can we bring that's a one example, right? The point I was trying to make, which to me is very interesting, is if we each as an individual or as a virtual community in this forum of growth and innovation, we get together, I don't know how, periodically or in a Facebook group or a virtual group to talk more about some topics. For example, how do we make the planet more sustainable? Does that make sense?
No, it makes total sense, Santiago. And in fact, I wrote in the book, I put in there a section on global warming as an example of not being forward-looking, right? I mean, we tend to show our human biases towards heavy discounting toward the present and heavy bias towards the present and discounting out the future and not really putting a priority on sustainability, just because I think it's in many people's minds, well, that's just way down the road. And you know, again, just dealing with sort of the challenges of today. I would give a concrete example about here that might spark the conversation or the thinking, and that would be, you know, the Paris Peace Accords. As I remember, the aspiration, the objective was how to bring down the temperature by 2 degrees, the average climate temperature by 2 degrees by a certain date. I don't remember when. Was it 2040 or 2030? Some time horizon. And you know, again, I think that you could say that's an aspiration and that's a goal, but it's not a vision. You know, the vision would be, what would be the hopeful narrative? Like, what would be the narrative of how things would look in 2030 or 2040 in a macro sense, in terms of the density of transportation that is non-electric or non-clean, the density of non-clean power plants, and you aggregate that all and you say, if you were going to be at 2 degrees less, what does the quote unquote portfolio of things have to look like in the world in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that would then get you to that objective? And I think you'd have to somehow, as a world community, be able to define that and say, this is what the story needs to be. This is what the world needs to look like to be at that level of sustainability. And then figure out, how do you walk that back to, well, how are we going to get there from here? it's going to be very complicated because we're all talking about nations and individual individual rules of law and how much is their government cooperation. But what can work, though, is with that insight, how do individual organizations and, as you said, groups of people work to try to do their part to contribute towards that overall picture, vision and future state. How can entrepreneurs, tell their hopeful story about what they're going to do? Years ago it didn't work out, but Shai Agassi from SAP, who then formed Better Place in Israel, was basically the car battery company that, had not just automobiles that were electric, but electric changing stations or battery changing stations to create this, ongoing network. It didn't work out for a host of reasons, but it was an entrepreneur trying to make the world a better place. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but what I do think is lacking, though, is we have an aspiration, but we don't have a vision. And I think you need a vision for sustainability, and a long-term vision that can kind of help be the North Star for individuals, for groups, for nations, and for the world, that would give greater clarity about what then needs to happen today in the different aspects to be able to realize that vision.
Thank you so much. Great.
Yep.
I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Ali.
Hello again, Mark. I'd like to explore how black swan events to the future back model would, impact it. And perhaps, I know you and I have talked about this before, but a sort of rapid deployment team within a company or a government to deal with the event at hand and adapt to the future vision. So I think those are two important things, not only from the COVID-19, but also 2008 and 2001 for 9/11 happening. Black swan events that you could not, possibly have predicted under any modeling.
Yeah, well, another great question, Ollie. What I would say in the management of black swan events, because to your point, they're not off a trend line. There's nothing that you can predict about them, hence why they're black swan. But what you can do is you can identify a set of them, and you might not get all of them, but you could definitely have a list. Like, we know that pandemics is a category of black swan, and we've known that for a long time. Cyber warfare, right? Cyber security, cyber terrorism, I mean. There are a set of black swan events, nuclear proliferation or dirty bombs, terrorism. There's a set of things, and even though you can't predict them happening, to your point, you can walk them back to a point and say, okay, what is it that we would need to have in place as a process by which we could rapidly deploy to be prepared for it as best we can, and to learn, and to be ready to learn. For example, as we know in the COVID-19, one of the important pieces about being prepared and to learn is rapid testing. So there have been a whole host of things that could have been in place. I look at future back in terms of these times in a two-part. One is, if there was more true forward-looking future back planning, you would then be able to be better prepared to deploy against the black swan. So I think more future back and true planning for it would have been helpful. Not that you would have known exactly the date when this would have happened, but you would have been more prepared to put in place the things to address the pandemic. The second part of future back is, now that this crisis is underway, how are we going to plan past it? So one is, how are we going to plan for the next black swan? This should have opened our eyes that we're probably in a world where even though black swans are black swans, maybe there's going to be more of them than ever before. So how do we deal in a world of black swan events? The only way you can is to war game them, if you will, and be able to say, if they were to happen, how would we be in the best position to respond to them, recognizing that we're not going to be able to just do everything instantly, but we could be much better prepared in the case where it is. And we know there are comparisons, right, of how South Korea has done compared to us. So I guess that's the way I would think about it, is one, being explicit about what are the black swan events, and two, if they happen, working backwards to them happening somewhere in the future, what is the best way today to be to be prepared to rapidly ramp up and be prepared to rapidly learn in the effort to achieve success against the black swan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark.
Sure.
Yeah, and due to constraints of time, we should probably wrap it up. Mark, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. And to all of you who joined us, thank you. This has been a great, great event, and we really appreciate everyone being here. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I offer one last point, because you asked me about it?
Of course.
A number of you, or I think Katie, you said had asked about this. I just want to share about how can you get an ebook. And unfortunately, Harvard's not going to allow for free of a Kindle ebook, but I can tell you that it's I think pretty well discounted. You can get it on Kindle for about $16. So while Forum can't offer the ebook for free, or we can't get it from Harvard Business School Publishing, hopefully $16 is better than the $30 list price. So there you go.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone, or depending where you are, night, afternoon.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.